Back on the right stand, and it's time for the real report. Ladies and gentlemen, on this edition of the Real Report, we turn the lens on China's debt trap diplomacy, where time and again we have shown you how the turmoil you see in Sri Lanka and Pakistan is the result of China's designs of economic imperialism. We have seen the crisis in the island nation of Sri Lanka, where after years of economic mismanagement, the nation's president fled the country amid the people's uprising and resigned as president. Now we have reported that he is running out of options after Singapore. But the role of the Chinese regime in pulling the rug from underneath the country is clear for everyone to see. Even in Pakistan now, we have seen how China's debt trap diplomacy has brought the nation to the brink of collapse, and the Chinese regime has now demanded military outposts on Pakistani soil to protect Chinese assets. However, this web of economic imperialism has spread to multiple nations across the world. Let's get you an overview of China's economic web. 42 nations owe debt bigger than 10% of their GDP. 74 lowest income nations owe 37% of their loans. Many debtor states hold unsustainable loans. Look at this. Maldives, GDP of 4.89 billion, Chinese loans $1.4 billion, 28.6% of its GDP. Sri Lanka, GDP $84.5 billion, Chinese loans $8.5 billion, 10% of its GDP, defaulted in May 2022. Pakistan, GDP of $346 billion, external debt of $130 billion, CPEC project is $65 billion, that's nearly 19% of its GDP. Nepal, $36.29 billion is its GDP, and Chinese loans $2.4 billion, 6% of its GDP. Zambia, $21.2 billion as a GDP, debt of $14.7 billion, of which $6.48 billion, nearly $6.5 billion is Chinese loans, 30% of its GDP. Laos, $18.83 billion is its GDP, debt of $14.5 billion, Chinese loans $7 billion, 37% of its GDP. Djibouti, strategically placed, very small East African nation, and it has GDP of $3.37 billion. Chinese loans are $2.4 billion, 71% of its GDP. Djibouti, quite literally, is in the throes of China, is in Chinese control, an African nation in Chinese control, and also strategically placed. Look it up in the map. Now we've seen the way the Chinese have treated their own people. We saw the visuals from the Henan province, where hundreds of people have been cut off from their money due to the corruption of the Chinese regime. The head of the Henan People's Bank is on the run. Meanwhile, after unleashing COVID virus on the world, the Chinese regime brutalized its own people, dragging them into containment centers and holding them hostage in their homes without food or water. The end game of the Chinese regime is to take advantage of political corruption in multiple nations and then seize their national assets. The people of these nations have to recognize the Chinese threat and demand better from their leaders, as the funds will not empower their nations but turn them into Chinese colonies. In that scenario, the repression of the Chinese regime awaits the people of these nations as well.